Hi, Founder fans. Jason here. Welcome to Founder of the Day Week in Review, 7 stories from the American Revolution, where we will be discussing the last 7 founders of the day on my website, Founder of the Day, and right here on YouTube. Thank you for coming. I do apologize for the weird time today. I actually, in my schedule, thought it would be later. It's just me with the kids this week, and I got them to bed earlier than I expected and got everything set up earlier than expected. So here we are, closer to our normal time than I expected, and I'll stop using the word expected from here on out. That being said, if someone wakes up, I might have to run away real quick. We'll hope that doesn't happen. They're pretty heavy sleepers, and they're used to me talking while they sleep. Anyway, let's get right into it. We're starting with Federal Farmer. So Federal Farmer number 13 is the last in the Federal Farmer series. Of course, Federal Farmer is a series of anti-federalist papers. Been doing them every Friday. Tomorrow we have kind of a wrap-up of all 13 of them coming up. But I'm going to put a poll out this weekend to see who we might want to do next. So let me know if you have any recommendations on an anti-federalist that you'd like me to cover. That being said, focusing on number 13, as it is the final, final Federal Farmer, it goes through a bit of a wrap-up, a recap of what he had covered, but then he ends with something new, federal districts, and he does not like federal districts. He does acknowledge that the reason there's a Washington, D.C. is because the mutiny of 1783 of the Pennsylvania line, right at the end of the Revolutionary War itself, a bunch of Pennsylvania soldiers from the Continental Army marched on the Continental Congress, and the state of Pennsylvania would not help with its militia. And because of that, the authors of the Constitution thought, hey, we need to step up here. We're going to need a federal district where the president has total and supreme authority, essentially. The Constitution also adds forts and ports that are federal and federal territories. And the Federal Farmer was very concerned that this was a bad omen, that giving the president and Congress supreme authority over every rule anywhere was a dangerous precedent, and especially in a situation where if you have a port that's under federal authority and right next door there's a port that's not, the federal port only pays federal taxes, but the state port pays both state and federal taxes, and that might be used as a way to convince people to join federal territories or federal areas and therefore give the president supreme authoritarian power. And that is the essence of Federal Farmer 1. So we're going to get right onto the founders. Federalists or anti-federalists are fun. We spend a lot of time on those. We're going to hang out with James Duane for a little bit. So James Duane is he was already important to the city of New York before the American Revolution began. I'll move this a little closer. I'm talking a little quieter than normal, so I'm going to move that a little closer. Excuse me. James Duane had already been Attorney General of the city of New York, and he'd already been an Indian agent, as they were called at the time, for the state of New York. So when the First Continental Congress is called, James Duane is one of the people sent to the First Continental Congress, and he is hesitant. He actually supports the Galloway Plan of Union right off the bat, but ends up siding with his contemporaries and signs the Continental Association instituting the boycott that was the result of the First Continental Congress. Thereafter, James Duane ends up going back home, and then he's sent back to the Second Continental Congress, though James Duane would end up being in the Continental Congress throughout the Revolutionary War. But he wasn't there when it was time to sign the Declaration of Independence. That being said, although he was nervous about the Declaration of Independence, he does support independence and remain a patriot. He would later end up going back to the Continental Congress. As I said, he kept going back to the Continental Congress, but he is one of the people there in the early 1780s when the problems with the Articles of Confederation really start to show themselves, and he ends up being a supporter of the new federal government. That being said, after the British evacuate, before the Constitution comes around, I should have said, after the British evacuate New York City in 1784, James Duane is elected mayor of New York City. And this is a huge position because not only is New York already growing rapidly in population and importance before the war, but after the war, all these loyalists leave, all these patriots had already fled. There's a huge glut of population. So James Duane ends up becoming mayor of this desperate city that's just starting to be refilled up with patriots. Really, a lot of jobs are empty. The whole city needs rebuilding, both figuratively and literally. I mean, a third of it burns in 1776, and that is not resolved before James Duane comes into power. Now, he's only there a few years, but he really puts New York on a path to become one of the more important cities in the young United States. He also argues this interesting case called Rutgers versus Waddington. Essentially, there was a woman who owned a tavern who was a patriot, and when the Patriots fled New York City, she left her tavern. A loyalist saw it open and took it. When the Patriots came back, she wanted to sue that loyalist for unpaid rents for using her building. She was doing this under New York's Trespass Act, which basically said that a loyalist could be sued if, in this type of situation, if they had trespassed on property and used it as their own. Unfortunately, the defense was run by Alexander Hamilton, who obviously was a future Federalist at this point, and who said that no, the Treaty of Paris overrules this. The Treaty of Paris says we can't sue people for rents and such, can't sue the loyalists. And the reason this relates to James Duane is James Duane, as mayor, was the one overseeing this court case. He was the supreme judge in this decision, and he rules with Alexander Hamilton that, sorry, lady, you cannot get money, unfortunately. As I said, this is not only was it important building New York City, but this was an important foreshadowing moment for the Constitution, giving authority to foreign treaties and decisions made in the Continental Congress and soon the United States Congress, as opposed to decisions made at the state level. So that's James Duane. We'll chug right along here today. Like I said, it's kind of a weird episode. It's a little bit later than usual and such. But we're going to talk about James Sherman. I think it's pronounced Sherman, but there's Roger Sherman, and this is more like Sherman. So I say it silly sometimes. That being said, two Jameses one weekend, last weekend. James Sherman had just graduated from Queens College, what we now call Rutgers, when the American Revolution broke out. And instead of starting a career, he ends up going and back to his home in New Jersey, and he puts together a unit for the Continental Army, and he goes and serves with the Continental Army. Unfortunately, he is very bravely serving in the Battle of Long Island, also known as the Battle of Brooklyn, when he is captured. And he spends 8 months in prison before he's able to escape. He goes back, he does continue serving in the Continental Army kind of sporadically, but he goes back to New Jersey to start his career, and he starts a mercantile firm, and the firm is wildly successful. And by the time the revolution is over, James is elected to the New Jersey Assembly, who then sends him to the Continental Congress. He is already, by the time he's in the Continental Congress, familiar with the problems facing the Articles of Confederation. And about this time, he is pretty quickly sent to the Annapolis Convention. The Annapolis Convention is very important. It's not really important, but it's telling. It was a year before the Constitutional Convention, and it was called together for states to send delegates to talk about amending or maybe recommending necessary changes to the Articles of Confederation that could improve the Union. Only 12 people from 5 states actually show up. It's interesting, though, as a person from New Jersey is basically told they can do whatever they want. They're the only ones with really wide-ranging powers. They go and nothing happens, except they write a letter to the Continental Congress suggesting a more serious convention, what they called the Philadelphia Convention, and what we today call the Constitutional Convention. Sherman doesn't go to the Constitutional Convention. He just goes to the Annapolis Convention. But as I said, it's a really important moment. He's there with the likes of Alexander Hamilton and James Madison, making these recommendations for an extreme overhaul of the Articles of Confederation. As I said, the Annapolis Convention was really for a little bit of changes to the Articles of Confederation, maybe a small change, but when New Jersey and James Sherman shows up with all these wide-ranging powers, and they kind of float the idea, well, maybe we need to make serious changes, that leads to the Constitutional Convention. James Sherman then goes on to, though he's not at the Constitutional Convention, he supports the Constitution and is elected as one of the inaugural members of the United States House of Representatives representing New Jersey. He's also probably best known actually for serving as mayor of New Brunswick, New Jersey, which he does for 17 non-consecutive years. Over like a 35-year span, he spends about half that time as mayor of his little town of New Brunswick. So that is James Sherman. We're going to move right along now to a much older gentleman when the Revolutionary War starts, Richard Richardson, which is just one of those names, isn't it? Richard Richardson. So Richard Richardson was already in his 70s when things get a little heated up in Boston. Down in South Carolina, the South Carolinians are a little nervous too, especially the patriotic ones. Their royal governor has already gone off to a boat on off the coast, and the Tories, there were a lot of still Tories inland. So the Patriots, in their shadow government, for lack of a better term, decide to get rid of some of these loyalists hanging out in the frontier. So they choose a gentleman who's already spent decades in the South Carolina militia, Richard Richardson, to take off, and they promote him to brigadier general. And they say, get out there and get rid of these loyalists. And that's what he does. Again, at 71 years old, he takes 1,000 men and sets off west. They end up routing out a whole bunch of patriots. Along the way, their numbers start to swell, not only with people supporting the cause, but because the loyalists were causing trouble out there. And he has a fairly decent force once he starts capturing loyalists who are not very well united, not anywhere near the force that Richardson has. This all kind of comes to a head at the Battle of Great Cane Break. Great Cane Break. Not easy to say. Where they surprise a group of 500 loyalists at dawn. They take them, and they head back to the coast. Now, this campaign becomes called the Snow Campaign because, yeah, we're talking about South Carolina, and on the way back, they get a snowstorm. It's not really even a little snow. I mean, I live in central New York. It is not a lot of snow. Take it from me. But it's not, they get like a decent amount of snow. So many of the Patriots just kind of leave. I mean, Richardson doesn't really need them anymore, so a whole bunch of the Patriots kind of go home, especially now that the Loyalists have been captured. Granted, they bring the Loyalists back and then let them go, kind of as a sign of good faith. You know, okay, you've learned your lesson. Now just go back to your frontier house and keep your mouth shut. As for Richardson, he would end up staying with the militia in South Carolina through a good portion of the war. He was at both battles of Charleston, but the second siege of Charleston in 1780, unfortunately, Richardson is one of the many, many people captured. Fortunately for him, he's 74 years old, and they release him almost right away, because he's already ailing at that age, and he's not really worth keeping around. He's going to be more of a nuisance than to essentially keep alive than it would be to just release him. And that's what they do. And unfortunately for him, you know, unfortunately, he does die just a few months later. And that's basically what the British did. They sent him home to die. And he does. Sadly, he was already a very old patriot when the war started, but he does his part. And he has one of the most fascinating campaigns of the battle, the Snow Campaign, where it's snowing in South Carolina. Probably would historically have been known as the Richardson Campaign had it not gotten snowed out, more or less. All right, and we're running through, and we had some kind of random guys this week with not too much to discuss, and they are all guys. So maybe next week I'll look for a lady to throw in there because I like to, variety is the spice of life. Nathaniel Prime. Okay. Nathaniel Prime is a very, very random person. By the time George Washington becomes president, Nathaniel Prime's only in his early 20s. And up to this point, he had been what's called a merchant's coachman, which means he rides around with a horse and buggy delivering packages for rich people, essentially. But most of these rich people were merchants. They all were merchants. They would pay him to do their merchanting wares. And through this position, he learned a good amount about investing and banking. It's just about that time, Alexander Hamilton resigns from the Washington administration, having created a very powerful national government, and he creates a few banks and a stock exchange. And Nathaniel Prime sees this, and he jumps on board, and he starts investing in stocks. He sets up a business which was at first titled, I believe it was Nathaniel Prime Stock and Commission Broker. Now, while today most of us recognize the term stockbroker, it's those wealthy dudes in Wall Street, doing whatever they do. Nathaniel Prime was one of the first people to actually have this job in the United States. It was very uncommon at the time. He kind of made it up. And he did a good job. He made a whole lot of money. In fact, he would later go on to recruit the grandsons of several founders, because, as I said, he's a little bit younger than most of the founders we discuss here, but including Samuel Ward III, whose father we are going to talk about next, James Gore King, the son of Rufus King, who's the final Federalist we discussed not too long ago, his brother-in-law Joseph Sands, and then eventually the name of the company becomes Prime, Ward, Sands, King, and Company. It's a whole mouthful. That's what they went with. They all become partners, and they make a lot of money, not just investing in the stock exchange and businesses in New York and in the United States, but investing really around the world, which is new at the time. They use this money to help finance and invest in the Erie Canal. And in fact, they take investments from their international trading partners to have foreign countries help invest in the Erie Canal. This was a huge risk, and it paid off big time, because the Erie Canal, as I've said before, it was the first information superhighway. Like, things, you could now suddenly get materials and information into and out of the interior of North America at a much more rapid pace than you could before. So this is a gigantic feat and very profitable. Now, Prime ends up retiring in his mid-60s and lives less than a decade after that when he decides to take his own life. He does this in a really excruciating manner, which I feel weird explaining. I did explain it in the other video. It's very morbid, so cover your ears if you are not excited to learn about this. But apparently he took a knife and used it to slice from ear to ear before stumbling out of the room and dying. So, not the most fun ending of any of these stories. But we'll continue right along. I am going through at an extremely rapid pace today. My last founder will take a little bit, but it's a weird day. I'm sorry. I didn't want to bail on you and not do them. But it's a very weird day. Alrighty then. Samuel Ward Jr. So we had just mentioned one of Nathaniel Prime's partners was Samuel Ward III. This is his father, Samuel Ward Jr. Real quick, let's talk about Samuel Ward Sr. Samuel Ward Sr. was a multi-time governor and Supreme Court Justice for Rhode Island, an original investee in Brown University. He went to the First Continental Congress, signed the Articles of Association, went to the Second Continental Congress, and then passed away in Philadelphia just before having the opportunity to vote for or sign in the Declaration of Independence. That being said, his son, Samuel Ward Jr., was one of the first graduating classes from Brown University that his father had invested in. He additionally, he joined the Continental Army. Sorry, I have notes in front of me, and I saw the wrong note, and I was like, wait, what? He didn't sign the article. Never mind. So he graduates college, and he decides to join his revolutionary father's footsteps and fight in the Revolutionary War. He joins Rhode Island's 1st Regiment under Christopher Green, which would later become integrated, which is fascinating. One of the few parts of the Continental Army where black and white soldiers served together. So as for Samuel Ward, he served in the Siege of Quebec and was almost immediately captured. He was one of those prisoners taken at the Siege of Quebec. He spends almost a year as a prisoner of war before being released. And sadly, it is while he's a prisoner of war that his father passes away in Philadelphia, and he misses those services. Additionally, he's a prisoner of war when, independence is declared, so he misses that also. He does return to the Continental Army after he's released. He ends up participating in the Battle of Red Bank and the Battle of Rhode Island, which is a really important and often overlooked battle of the Revolution. He then resigns from the Continental Army in the final months of the year. So he serves for almost the entirety of the war, despite losing his father and being a prisoner of war and such. Let's see here. After this, he starts investing in international trade, another broker, which makes sense that his son would become a stockbroker as well. Ward, he starts a company called Samuel Ward and Brothers, which I just love that, like, a bunch of brothers all got together and they said, let's name the company after just the one brother, and all the rest, we'll just all fall under Brothers. It's not like Ward and Sons, I get. It's a guy and his kids, but like a guy and his brothers? Anyway, I'm not going to get carried away with it. So Samuel Ward and Brothers starts trading with Europe. He actually was also elected to attend the Annapolis Convention, where James Sherman was, that we were speaking about earlier, but he doesn't attend. Most people don't attend. No one from Rhode Island showed up. No one from most states showed up. Several states showed up after they had already met and left. So it is kind of chaotic. Now, Samuel Ward Jr., interestingly, he actually travels to both Asia and Africa. One of the first Americans after the Revolution to do so. It's a long trip on a boat. He sails pretty much around the world. Not something you usually see of a wealthy person who owns these kinds of merchant firms. Usually they just send the boats out and stay put. Maybe go to Europe. But Ward had the time and the money, and he wanted to make connections, and he does make connections. And it's actually, by the time he returns, he's developed both his reputation as a trader and as kind of an unofficial diplomat, where during the Washington administration, Thomas Jefferson, as first Secretary of State, kind of relies on Samuel Ward to learn a lot about places the Secretary of State needs to know about, but Thomas Jefferson certainly had never been. One of the core parts of the article and video I made this week was about Ward's boat, the Jay. The Jay was a ship that was captured by the British. Now, they were they accused Ward of a variety of things, basically keeping things on his ship that he should have paid taxes to the British. Essentially, it was not the first and far from the last in a long line of ships that were American captured by the British between the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812 that led to the War of 1812. It's very interesting that the boat is named the Jay after John Jay, and just about a year after this, John Jay goes to Great Britain to negotiate the Jay Treaty to end this kind of thing, which it doesn't, but whatever. At least Jay's reputation was kind of scarred. At least there was that. Great, Jay. I'm being silly, of course. I'm not trying to insult John Jay fans out there. John Jay himself admitted that he could walk from I think it was Boston to Philadelphia by his own burning effigy. So he knew it. What's up, Galloway? Thanks for coming, man. I appreciate it. We're a little off tonight, a little weird time. We're kind of running through quick. It's just me and the kids this week, so things are weird. Next week, September's over, back to normal for the next 11 months. Can't wait. Anyway, because of his dealings with Great Britain capturing his ship and not being able to get his ship back and trying to get the federal government to help repay some of the debts he lost, he gets real upset with the Democratic Republican Party, and he becomes a Federalist. He stays a Federalist for a while, and he actually ends up attending the Hartford Convention, which, as I've said, the Hartford Convention in 1814 was during the War of 1812. It was complaining about a whole slew of things that were going on with the government. There were whispers that New England might want to cede from the Union, maybe even join Great Britain and fight against the South. None of that was really happening. In fact, most of the people who were sent there were purposely sent there by their states to make sure that didn't happen. But still, attending it didn't help because they did make recommendations to amend the Constitution. Things like you could only have one, if someone from Virginia was president, the next president had to be from a different state, because after Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, there was only 4 years of Adams that was not Virginia. And wink, wink, after that, there would still be another 8 years of James Monroe from Virginia. And after that, it was John Quincy Adams from Massachusetts. So the first 5 presidents were from 2 states. So they had a little bit of a point, but they sent those amendments recommended amendments right at the same time that Washington, D.C. is learning the war is over with the Treaty of Ghent. And even though the war had already ended, Andrew Jackson had a major victory down in New Orleans. So after this, Ward's political career was essentially over, but that's all right. He retired to the life of a wealthy investor. I'm going to take a quick sip of water while we pull up our final founder today. Really running through it way quicker than usual. And I do apologize for disappointing anyone, but as I've said it several times now, It's been a week. All right. We are going to end with a bang. Fall War, Skipwith, and the Republic of West Florida. Yeah. The independent nation of West Florida. So let's start at the beginning of Skipwith's life. He was 16 years old when he drops out of the College of William and Mary to join the Continental Army. And he does. And he goes right to battle. And it just so happens his first taste of war is the victory at Yorktown. That was easy. Full war. Anyway, he was a distant cousin of Thomas Jefferson. He ends up starting a career as a merchant, specializing in the sale of tobacco. His father owned a large plantation, as many of the wealthy Southerners did. Skipwith, of course, made much of his inheritance and came from a family that had made much money off the backs of enslaved labor. That being said, he decides to go on the merchant route, which is a little uncommon for people of his status in society at the time. But by 1786, he actually travels to London on business. And he ends up just staying in Europe for a while. Now, when Washington becomes president, Skipwith is one of the people chosen to become an American consul in Europe. Again, a consul is different than an ambassador. An ambassador speaks for the United States, on behalf of the United States to another nation. A consul represents the citizens of the United States. A consul basically runs the embassy. So if you're in another nation and you're in trouble and you got to go to the American embassy, you're under the care of the consul. The ambassador doesn't care about you. The consul does. Skipwith ends up rising in rank until he becomes the consul general of Paris, which is the most important consul in France, arguably the most important one in Europe at the time. In this situation, he's working under ambassador or minister to France, James Monroe. James Monroe, of course, ends up kind of pissing off George Washington, gets recalled, and this does not reflect well on Skipwith because he had worked so closely with Monroe. Now, people get over it pretty quickly. He stays in his position, but he eventually wants to return to North America. When he gets to North America, there's another revolution. So he ends up moving to what was then called West Florida. There were two Floridas, East and West. East is basically today's Florida, and West is the part of Alabama and Mississippi that touch the Gulf Coast, with a little touch of Louisiana. Baton Rouge counts as West Florida at the time. Now, both of these were owned by the Spanish. Skipwith goes there. He's there a while, and then the Louisiana Purchase happens. The Louisiana Purchase, I need to remind you, we famously purchased Louisiana from France under Napoleon. But France had only bought Louisiana from the Spanish about 6 months before that. They essentially flipped Louisiana territory. They bought it real quick and sold it to the Americans. So quick, in fact, that when the Americans go to take over New Orleans, they have to run down the Spanish flag, run up the French flag, to demonstrate the French did own this and sell it, run down the French flag, and run back up an American flag. Now, Louisiana territory is huge and goes west, but it does not really include Florida, and Spain still claimed both East and West Florida as their own. Now, there were some questions about parts of West Florida. Adding to this, a bunch of loyalists who had fled the colonies during the Revolutionary War ended up in West Florida, which at the time was still being run by the Spanish, who thought they had control of it. Though the Americans disagreed, they were still letting the Spanish run it because not that many people were living there, except people were moving there. The Loyalists had moved there. There were Spanish people there. And now you have Americans moving in because if it's going to be America, we got to set up some businesses. We got money to make. And Fall War Skipwith, again, one of the great names in the world, ends up moving to West Florida. He's there for a while, about a decade, until 1810, I believe it was, when there's a little bit of a war breaks out. It's kind of a civil war with three sides: the Spanish, the former Loyalists, who are like Britain, and the new American patriots, who are coming in to take over. The Americans, the Loyalists, don't really have much of any say in the matter, so they're kind of brushed aside. But the Loyalists end up attacking and taking Baton Rouge, which is the capital of West Florida, or at least the most important city in West Florida at the time. So they've now attacked the Spanish on what the Spanish consider Spanish territory. This puts President James Madison in quite a predicament. You see, he needs to put a stop to this. The Americans are out of hand. You know what? I'm going to step back real quick. After the Americans and full war Skipwith take Baton Rouge, they end up declaring an independent nation. They write a constitution, and after a few weeks, they elect a governor. Full war Skipwith. Now, though they are kind of an independent nation, you'll notice they don't write president in their constitution. They write governor. And there's a very important reason for this. It's that Skipwith and his comrades anticipated becoming a state in the Union. They wanted to be Americans. They did not want to be an independent nation surrounded by America with Spanish Florida right there. They wanted to be a state in the Union. They had the numbers for it. They really fit all the qualifications, but they did not want to be annexed as a territory. Because if they're annexed as a territory, then they are just part of the federal government, like we were talking about earlier with the final federal farmer paper. They're federal territory where the president can do whatever he wants with it. They want to be annexed as a state. They had already written a constitution. They just wanted to send some representatives to Congress and be cool about it. That being said, James Monroe certainly wasn't cool about it. He was very upset that this happened. He didn't want to send in troops to stop this rebellion because it's on Spanish territory. He doesn't want to send troops into Spain. He's about to start a war with Great Britain. The War of 1812 is just about a year and a half away. He also doesn't want to... He's unhappy that he thought it was still questionable who actually owned this territory. Now, it would be another 10 years or so before the Adams-Onis Treaty annexes all of Florida to the United States. So this is a very touchy subject. James Madison does decide to send troops in to suppress this rebellion, essentially on behalf of Spain. He does this, and when they arrive, Skipwith and his militia, outgunned and outmanned, wisely decide to surrender immediately. And because they surrender immediately, there's no prosecution. No one's charged with any crimes, really, because, to be fair, the Spanish weren't being great about it either. And while we'd always been friendly with Spain, we were not very friendly with Spain. Like, throughout, from the Revolution through the War of 1812, like, we were on good terms with Spain, but Spain was never really nice to us. They were just like the bully in school who you let push you around because then they're on your side when you really need it to count. And that's essentially how it went. And that the end result is that Full War Skipwith was president, or I guess governor, of the independent nation of the Republic of West Florida for almost 12 days. There it is, Full War. 12 days running a nation. Oh well, it was a nice try. Founder fans, I do appreciate you guys coming today. I know the timing was weird. I know this whole, like I keep saying, this week's been weird. It's been very weird. But on Saturday, tomorrow we're doing trivia, 8:30. Saturday at 8:15 p.m. Eastern Time, we are going to do my annual 100 top 100 founders fantasy draft rankings. I never even know what to call it. The top 100 founders spectacular. I call it draft rankings because it's like fantasy sports season, so I figured that'd be fun. I do it every year. It does change every year based on what I learn, and it's subjective, a lot of it. So it's who I feel is more important to the cause as a whole. I'm going to put something out on Twitter and on other social medias this week, letting you guys know, or asking you guys to submit what you think my top 20 might be. So go ahead and send that in. We'll see who's closest. As for that, I'm going to call it for the weekend. Thank you for your patience with me today. With my weird time, blasting through it kind of quick. But I am your humble servant, and it is Thursday, which is not Peacefield, it is Round Bottom. So, Founder fans, Round Bottom.